Hi, Khalid.
Hello, Mandy.
How are you?
I'm good, thanks.
Are you ready to talk about the rising signs?
Yes.
The rising signs, the ascendants. So just to be clear, on this video, we're going to talk about the rising sign, stroke ascendant, which is two different phrases meaning the same thing. And everybody's got one. Not everybody will know what theirs is. But today we're going to talk about the earth signs. So that's... Sorry, we may get a bit of this. We've got a visiting dog today, so she's been a bit noisy. So this would be Taurus, Virgo, or Capricorn rising. If you have any of those as your rising sign, this could be quite an interesting video. So, yeah, before we sort of go into the individual signs, can you explain what is a rising sign or an ascendant?
So the rising sign is that the zodiac sign is visible on the eastern horizon of wherever you're located at the time of your birth. And so basically it's based on the rotation of the Earth. Because the Earth completes a single rotation around its own axis every 24 hours, it passes through all of the 12 zodiac signs, which are equal divisions of the sky. And so more or less, it would complete its passage through a single zodiac sign around every 2 hours, right? But the duration might be different depending on what latitude your location is when you were born. Yeah. So, and I could add that actually for the ancient ascending sign was more important than the sun sign, because it was kind of the starting point from which they drew the entire birth chart for a person. So the rising sign would mark the point at which the first house, right, of a person's chart, which is the house of selfhood and individuality, and even according to some interpretations, like the physical appearance, right? That's the house that covers all of these areas, right? So they're very significant areas of life, and then based on the position, like between those 30 degrees that comprise each of the 12 signs. So based on the position, the particular degree of the rising sign that applies to your time of birth, the whole chart, the whole 12 houses would be drawn, right? And then those houses would be distributed in different ways over the other signs of the zodiac, the other remaining 11 signs of the zodiac, right? And that interaction between house and sign then would be pretty much specific to every person born, right? Because the time and location of birth would give you a different rising sign, and if not a different rising sign, then a different degree of the rising sign. Yeah.
Right, okay. So just so that I understand this completely, in one 24-hour day, because we turn on our axis, there would be 12 different signs would come up over the horizon. Each one of the 12 would show. So yeah, so there's 12 possibilities within one day of what your rising sign could be, and you're only going to find that out if you pretty much know your birth time. Then you would be able to sort of say at that time, or in that window of time on the day, it was, for example, Taurus rising, which is what I am. Okay, and that would vary. And obviously, because it's coming up over the eastern horizon, that sign that comes up at that point every day, that is where a person's first house would be. So
Yes.
your rising sign is always kind of connected to your first house, which is the house of the self. So, for example, my house of the self would be Taurus. So everything that kind of is important in the first house for me would be the qualities and characteristics of a Taurus person. That is kind of like about me personally, because the first house is the house of the self, and there's 12 houses altogether, but everybody's going to have something different in their first house, and it's all determined by the rising sign,
right?
And that triggers off all the other which signs are in all your other 12 houses as well. So it's very important, the rising sign, whether or not there are any planets in it adds to the kind of, the intrigue of it. But it is, if you know your birth time, that obviously gives access to an awful lot of information. Absolutely. Because it lines up everything else. So that's why it's a shame when people say that they only know their date of birth.
Yes.
And obviously it's easier said than done getting your birth time. Yes. But if you can possibly know your birth time, that could really make a difference to the amount of information that can be extracted from an entire astrology chart. That's very interesting. Yeah. That's fair. And I think it probably sounds a bit complicated until you've got your head around it. And then when it makes sense, it's actually quite simple. It really is quite simple. Right. So, assuming that you were like me and Taurus happened to be coming up over the eastern horizon at the time of birth, as I say, I am Taurus rising. And so therefore, as well as triggering off the house system, the rising sign has a sort of a meaning within itself, because below the horizon, it's kind of out of sight. And as you emerge above the horizon, everything comes into view. And that is exactly what is associated with the rising sign. It's kind of your first impression of things. And also the world's first impression of you. It's a kind of a two-way thing. And they say it's a filter. It is a filter. Yes. So I mean, what else do you feel about the kind of character or the description of what a rising sign is? I mean, we've explained it.
So very important kind of I guess distinction I think that we need to address when we talk about rising signs. So we say that they're the signs that are associated with the first house, which covers the self, the personality. I think we need to kind of really be specific and say that that selfhood in that context means the self in relation to as perceived by society on a more, let's say, on a more tangible level, right? Okay, so not the self as it's experienced by necessarily as it's experienced very deeply by the individual we're concerned, right? But more the self as perceived on the plane of social relations,
So the outer shell and how you just go through your day-to-day life.
Yes, so like concepts like outer shell, social mask, persona, I think they're pretty helpful in distinguishing how the rising sign defines you as opposed to how the sun sign defines you. And I think it's very important for 20th century people who've inherited 20th century astrology and even 21st century astrology to understand this distinction, because still most people who are into astrology, they sort of rely on the sun sign to describe every aspect of themselves, right? Every aspect of themselves that they are consciously aware of and that they expect other people to pick up on, right? And the rising sign is important to know, not simply because of its importance in traditional astrology and the whole house system and in the whole kind of philosophy of astrology really, but also because it helps explain why so many people, when you meet them, you might assume that they're one sign, and then you discover one sun sign, and then you discover that their sun sign is actually very different from what you thought they were, right? And I think the distinction between rising sign and sun sign can help us understand the gap between what other people perceive and maybe what you see yourself as, right? Yeah.
Interesting. Yeah. Yeah. I mean, I can definitely relate to a lot of the things in both my sun sign and actually definitely in my rising sign. I definitely can't say, oh, no, none of that applies to me. As I say, I'm Taurus rising, and Taurus is it's a fixed sign. It's very steady, very reliable, very, bit slow, as in kind of, like long, not in a particular rush, all that sort of thing. I can honestly relate to all of that. Enjoys kind of eating. I definitely, that is definitely me. I would say, yeah, I am very fixed, and interestingly, I've got Aquarius as my sun sign, which is also a fixed sign in a different way. And I feel that fixed thing. I stick with situations. I persevere with things. I will sometimes stay with situations longer than they deserve, and that is very. I would say that is pretty Taurus as well. Yeah.
So would you say that that's kind of like that is about you getting attached to fixed routines, right? Fixed life arrangements, right? That makes you comfortable, kind of going through life in a more or less predictable way. That part of you, the rising sign part of you.
Yeah. Comfortable is definitely a word that I would attach to Taurus. And yes, well, I mean, we all like to feel comfortable, but to get yourself comfortable in something that is maybe not in the best interest to sort of be, you could be comfortable on a sofa, but if you sit on it for too long, it's not good for you. Sometimes we have to kind of get up and move and kind of do things and move on. And the Taurus part can sort of hold you back, I think, from doing that. But on the positive side, Taurus, as I say, is steady, reliable, loyal, hardworking, appreciates nice things. So a lot of positive things to be said about Taurus and about the Taurus rising sign. I kind of like feel, I could be wrong here, but with it being a rising sign, I think people trust me. I think they sort of think, oh yes, she seems very professional. She seems very trustworthy. I feel that I could rely on her. I think that's the impression I give people, and that impression.
Actually, that's the impression I get from you.
Yeah, and that impression would be really, really true. And I think people also kind of lean on me a bit as well. Like you've got the tarot card, the Empress, which is like Mother Earth, but she's very cozy. She's very comfortable. She's very motherly. So, I mean, even though the mother is sort of more Cancer, I do see the Empress. I put the Empress into Taurus, and she's very motherly. And yeah, I mean, I can really see myself associated with that Taurus rising. But the other thing you do have to take into consideration, which is very important, and really shapes in a way your rising sign is what planets, if any, are in that sign at your time of birth. You know, if there are any planets in that first house or in your sign, that needs to be taken into consideration. And whether they are planets that are kind of compatible with your sign, or whether they bring out, what I'm trying to say is whether they're going to bring up the best in your sign or the worst in your sign. I mean, Taurus is ruled by Venus. So if you had Venus in Taurus as your rising sign, that would be an extremely positive version of Taurus. If Venus was there, which it isn't in my case, but you know, also the moon is exalted in Venus. The moon, which is the planet of the mother, loves being in Taurus. So if the moon was there, you would have a fantastic, strong Venus. Now, the planets that don't go so well in Taurus, I just need to remind myself of this. Is it Mars? Yeah, Mars. Right. Yeah, Mars does not work well in the sign of Taurus. So I kind of like feel if you happen to have Taurus rising with Mars there, that may bring out the worst in the sign of Taurus. That may affect it in a kind of a detrimental way. And I think the other thing is you need to also look at where in your chart Venus is, because Venus rules Taurus. Venus is the planet Venus is worth looking at wherever that may be in your chart if it's in a good place. So it's kind of like the home planet for Venus, for Taurus, is Venus, but it's kind of like it's left home, it's gone off on its travels somewhere, and wherever that may be, is it having a good time? Is it welcome where it is? Because that may affect your Taurus rising. So it's just an extra bit of information to look at, and you have to kind of really put all these things together to know what sort of Taurus rising you are. You know, whether you're Taurus in the most positive sense of the word, and that is the first impression people are getting of you, and the first impression that you tend to have of people, or whether you have difficulties with it, or whether, you know, whether it's just a neutral kind of Taurus, you know. So that is my take on Taurus rising. Solid, steady, reliable, probably eats too much, enjoys their comforts, pretty much dependable, but on the downside could just stick with things too long for their own good. That would be my summary of a Taurus rising.
So a lot of astrology has so a lot of astrologers have described Taurus as a sign that gains comfort and a sense of kind of stability or good rhythm from regular contact with nature. Do you feel that that's going on with you in your life?
I forgot to mention the nature bit. I do think I definitely appreciate nature. I like it when the weather's nice and I can be out in my garden, whatever, or going for a nice walk. But I kind of like feel there are some people who would really kind of like want to be out in nature on a much more adventurous scale than me. That doesn't mean I dislike nature, no, not at all. But I think my appreciation of nature is in quite funnily enough, a lazy Taurus way, rather than in kind of, I'm going to climb the mountains because it's nature. Do you know what I mean? Or so yeah, I don't do nature in a particularly adventurous or brave way. I do it in a very comfortable way, which actually probably is quite Taurus if you think about it.
No, it's interesting because like, I'm thinking of, again, in my head I'm revisiting that distinction between rising sign and sun sign, and I'm trying to imagine what sort of, whether or not there would be like a different relationship with nature based on whether someone has the rising sign in Taurus versus the sun in Taurus, you know?
That's a
And
really good question.
yeah, and just kind of, I get the feeling that
Yes.
maybe if your sun was in Taurus, you might
Do the gardening yourself. Whereas
yeah,
I like to get someone to come around and do it for me, so I can just sit in it and enjoy it.
yeah, like
Yes.
you might feel like it's like that connection with nature has a deeper meaning, you know.
If it's
Like
the
you
sun
can
sign.
identify with it, you know.
Yeah,
Like
maybe someone who's got a sun in Taurus might grow all their own vegetables and cook everything from scratch. Whereas I would I would just appreciate that bowl of food that the sun in Taurus person made. I would sit there and if they go, oh, we grew these all ourselves in our own garden, I go, oh, that's lovely. Oh, it's delicious. And I would just, you know, so yes, I'd be a much more superficial level of Taurus, I think. That's a very good question to consider. I like
yeah,
that.
I think it's a pretty complicated distinction that, you know, it can be explored for a very long time.
Yes.
Yeah. I'm wondering also if, like, I guess this could apply to all the rising earth signs, this question, but I'm wondering if, and it applies to me because I have Capricorn rising, but like if it feels safer for an earth rising sign person to kind of approach reality in a more practical way, and to rely on verifiable kind of sources of information to get their to build their kind of impression of reality and to decide how to live in the real world, like in the tangible world, right? You know, as opposed to kind of developing your perception of reality based on ideas in your head, you know, or but based on like energy that's coming from inside you, you know? Yeah. So I don't know, what do you think about that?
There again, I think it depends on how the rising sign perhaps connects with your personal sun sign.
Okay.
Because I would say, because my sun sign is a fixed sign, therefore I feel all of the qualities of Taurus being a fixed sign, even though it's fixed earth, I suppose, and my sun's fixed air, I feel the two fixed energies together bring out the fixed side of Taurus as if it was a sun sign. I do honestly feel I'm probably as stubborn and fixed and will stick with something as equally from having it as a rising sign as if it was my sun sign, that part of it. Whereas the Mother Earth stuff and all the kind of nature stuff, I feel I'm more sort of superficial about than I could be. I don't mean I don't like it or that I don't enjoy it, but it is on a surface level rather than getting really stuck in. I don't go out in my garden in Wellington boots and mud and a spade and, you know, whereas I kind of think a real Taurus person, sun sign person, probably would be inclined to kind of do that.
Yeah.
I think that's the difference.
Makes sense.
But that's a really good food for thought thing, the difference between the sun and the rising. Because I do feel the Taurus thing in certain ways. Like I say, I feel it strongly. I don't feel it, but I think that's the fixed part for me. And that's because I've got a fixed sun.
Makes sense.
It does, doesn't it, actually, when you think about it?
Yeah.
Well done for posing that question. So moving on to Virgo, you know, if somebody was a Virgo rising, what do you make of that? Do you want to talk about the Virgo? I think you won the Virgo competition.
So I have one good friend. She's not a Virgo rising, but she has Sun and Mercury in Virgo, and Mercury because it is the ruler of Virgo, I think. So it adds to the Virgo energy in her chart. And I have another friend who has the sun in Virgo and the rising sign in Virgo. So based on my experiences of people with a lot of Virgo energy, and based on what I've read specifically about Virgo as a rising sign, I would say that if you have Virgo as a rising sign, you're likely to kind of navigate your way through your surroundings in a very vigilant manner, and always try to analyze things, right, to make sure that you have a good mental grasp of them. And so because the Virgo kind of psychology is about, it's kind of like motivated always to develop, to conceptualize like a better version of things, of reality, right? A better reality, right? And dedicate their energy toward that better vision of reality. They'll find themselves driven to observe and point out what's lacking in the picture, right? The flaws,
Yes.
the mistakes,
Critical.
And what's interesting is that, okay, at the same time that they have this ability to kind of maybe be detached and, let's say, criticize things from a more philosophical perspective, I would say they have this tendency that it's at least as powerful to analyze things from a perspective that is more uniquely theirs. That it's like they build over time a kind of a vision of what is beautiful, what is suitable, what is balanced, right? What is worth striving for. And that this vision will be more kind of tailored to their individual story, whatever it is, right? And so they'll put in a lot of the energy to kind of remodel the environment they're in so that it matches this ideal image that they have, right? So I imagine that someone with a Virgo rising personality would be, they would come across as very mentally agile, having a sharp eye for detail, reliable because they take commitments seriously. They're not, and I think that's because of how the planet Mercury operates when it's in an Earth sign, right? As opposed to an air sign, Gemini, which it also rules, But I think when it's in Gemini, it's more playful and less concerned with commitments. When it's in the Earth sign of Virgo, this planet is more driven to use its intelligence and its genius to manifest better versions of reality, right? So I think that kind of energy, you would be likely to pick up on that kind of energy from someone with a Virgo rising sign, which also helps us understand the historical connection between the sign of Virgo and the sixth house of the zodiac wheel. And I don't want to get deep into the topic of houses, but I'll just kind of briefly say that the sixth house involves like service, among other things, service rendered to the community, and a certain kind of perfectionism tied to that impulse to serve, right? So you'll notice in people who are visibly Virgo, right, who might have Virgo as the rising sign, you'll notice that they like to come across as reliable, and that that they have they can get a quick handle over information that is important to kind of, it's important for them and for everyone around them to improve the situation they have in common, right? And so I think Virgo rising people give the impression of being genuinely interested in being helpful, and also I mean, alert to details and vigilant in both kind of positive and maybe not so positive ways, right? So they're very likely to point out like something that you missed, something that skipped your mind. Let's say something you should have done while planning for a conference, for example, or for a trip, something that skipped your mind, but is actually important for you to do in order to have a successful conference or trip. But they'd be equally likely to point out to you what's missing from your outfit, which would make them feel better if you had it, not necessarily because it fits in with your aesthetic vision. Yeah. So I think Virgo rising is a pretty complex. That definitely come across as a pretty complex personality. And I think you would feel that drive to manipulate, or say maneuver the external circumstances, so that they more closely align with their vision of what's the good reality, what's the good situation.
Yeah, I definitely feel that the Virgo rising is going to come across as being kind and helpful and kind of, like there to sort of, willing to kind of like, do things to please. Definitely so. Whereas I kind of like feel maybe the Virgo sun is not so bothered about kind of giving the impression of being helpful, not so bothered of advertising the fact they just will be helpful. I think the Virgo sun is more likely to do random acts of anonymous kindness, whereas the Virgo rising sign will probably kind of want people to know that they did this good deed, right? There's two types of helpful people. There are people that genuinely just naturally do it, like be really, really kind and helpful. And there's those that are kind of like, there's something about them that they're kind of doing it for their own kind of personal gratification or whatever, if you get what I'm saying. I've got certain people in mind that I'm thinking of, like as I'm saying this. So, and I don't even know whether they're Virgo or not, but yeah.
It's really interesting because one person I'm very close to, who has both her sun in Virgo and her Virgo rising, I noticed that she, by nature, like she's always like has an open ear to other people's issues, other people's problems, and she's very invested in kind of coming up with solutions for those problems.
Yeah, so it's coming from the right place.
Yes, absolutely.
With the sun sign, whereas I wouldn't necessarily trust it so much with the rising sign. I'm not necessarily saying it is completely fake.
No, right? In this case, it's both. So it's like sun and rising, and I feel like so then the energy, that kind of energy gets amplified,
Yeah. And I also think because of the health conscious thing, I think that the genuine sun in Virgo maybe does really kind of try to look after themselves, whereas I kind of like feel I've got that the wrong way round. I feel, sorry, the rising Virgo wants to kind of like appear to be healthy, will possibly do all of the right things to try and keep healthy, whereas the sun in Virgo maybe is more about helping other people's health than their own.
Ah, that's interesting. Yeah, that's really interesting.
I mean, the sun in Virgo person might be a nurse or something like that, that is very dedicated to the service and helping of other people. Whereas the rising Virgo that's going to be in the first house, which is all about the self, may be kind of like, you know, all their attention is on their own well-being.
I see.
I almost think that Virgo is quite an easy one, easier to define the difference between the sun and the rising sign version of it, possibly.
Okay.
And also, just to sort of mention, to take into consideration, Mercury does rule Virgo, but Mercury is also exalted in Virgo. So Mercury is very, very strong in Virgo. So if you were to have Virgo rising and you had Mercury in your rising sign, that would be an incredibly strong place. But yeah, you do need to look where Mercury is in your chart, because Mercury can be that little gossip and the little critical side of the Virgo rising could be defined better, where the Virgo rising is maybe criticizing other people just to make themselves feel better. It might be wherever that Mercury is in the chart may establish which area of life that criticism is going to kind of
yeah, definitely, that makes sense. Would you say that it's more important for a Virgo rising sign to maintain their own health, their physical health, than it would be for a Virgo sun sign, because it would be more important for a Virgo rising sign to be publicly seen as on top of things and control of themselves, of their environment.
Possibly so, yeah. Possibly so. And the interesting thing as well is the two planets that are not good in Virgo are Venus and Jupiter, which are the two most beneficial planets. Neither of them do well in the sign of Virgo. That's interesting, don't you think? That the two most positive planets in a chart would be weakened in the sign of Virgo. It's almost like maybe they can't really do their full goodness in a sign that is so critical and that is so kind of like, you know, like always paying attention to the tiny weeny little details. It just doesn't maybe let the beauty of things come through, or the abundance of things come through.
That is really interesting, because it touches on the question of which planet is more philosophical, Mercury or Jupiter, and also which signs are more philosophical, those ruled by Jupiter or those ruled by Mercury, you know? So basically we have, on the side of Jupiter, we have Sagittarius and Pisces.
Yes.
And on the side of Mercury, we have Virgo and Gemini, you know? Yeah. So that's interesting. I never thought of it from the angle of Venus also. But yeah, I guess it makes sense that you maybe might miss out on a lot of life's beauty if you're
constantly finding the fault in things, or kind of like, oh, you're being such a perfectionist that you miss on, like, sometimes beauty is in imperfection. I mean, they even write songs about that, don't they? Do you know what I mean? Things don't have to be absolutely perfect. Like sometimes if you're so striving for perfection, it's losing its spirit, you know?
Yes. So Cindy, just to clarify this a bit, so basically, because Venus is exalted in Pisces and Virgo lies opposite Pisces, Venus is considered to be in a fallen state in Virgo.
Yeah.
And if we accept that Venus is a planet of beauty, right?
Yeah.
And meaningful beauty, then what you're saying makes perfect sense. It's hard to find beauty when you're just when your head is just stuck in the gritty details,
Yeah.
And then Jupiter Jupiter rules Sagittarius and
Pisces.
And Pisces, right? Jupiter rules Pisces. So also Jupiter, I guess because it's an expansive planet and also kind of likes to look at the bigger picture and is by nature it's optimistic by nature, right? That would help us understand why it would be unhappy in Virgo. But also if you consider like the old kind of association between Sagittarius and philosophy, and also consider that Jupiter is the natural ruler of Sagittarius, you could also understand why it wouldn't be so happy in Gemini, another sign ruled by Mercury, because Gemini energy is more about playing around with ideas because you have an overactive mind. Just playing around with ideas, dabble a bit here, dabble a bit there. Whereas with Sagittarius, it's more about like exploring really broad horizons because you're interested in the bigger picture, Yeah. So yeah, it's interesting, like thinking about any sign becomes much more interesting when you think about the sign's connection to the planets, right?
Yeah.
The planets that rule it and the planets that feel unhappy in it. Yeah.
So if you have got a Virgo rising sign, you need to kind of look at what planets, if any, are in your rising sign. There might not be any planets there, but even if there are no planets there, you need to kind of check out where Venus is. Not Venus, Mercury is.
Yes.
You need to check out where Mercury is and know a little bit about that sign, wherever Mercury is, and blend that in with all the kind of like the Virgo rising sign stuff, because that will define what sort of a Virgo rising you are.
Yes.
And if there are any planets that are in Virgo, you kind of you want to hope they're not Venus or Jupiter.
Yeah.
Basically,
One thing before we move on to Capricorn, because you're talking about Mercury.
Yeah.
So one important thing that will determine how your rising sign gets expressed is what planets have an aspect to it. So one form of the aspect is if a planet is basically conjoined with the position of the rising sign. So if the rising sign is in 15 degrees of Virgo and Mercury is at, let's say, 13, somewhere between 12 to 18 degrees of Virgo, then it would be considered conjunct. And so very likely you come across very strongly as a Virgo personality, okay? If any other planet that is not Mercury, okay, let's take the example, let's say Jupiter, for example, is in a definite aspect with the degree of your rising sign, right? Then the character of that rising sign would be very much
affected.
Altered.
Yeah, definitely.
Very much altered.
Yeah. I mean, it's possibly getting a little bit kind of complicated, but your rising sign will be affected by anything that it has a kind of a connection with, which is kind of like for another video to sort of talk about. But but I think it's a fascinating thing, the rising sign, because you can say that a rising sign is very much a part of who you are because it's that first impression thing. but even that rising sign will have different shades of color according to where the planet is that rules it, according to any other planets that are kind of happen to be in it at the time, you know, and that will all kind of color it. It won't just be a blanket statement that, you know, Virgo rising means that. There'll be all sorts of other information about that specific Virgo rising sign, and that's before you even start connecting it to other planets that.
And I think also it could be drastically modified by what your sun sign and what your sun sign and what your moon sign is also, for sure.
But practical, helpful, hardworking, and detail orientated, which could be a good thing or could be really annoying, and could possibly be not good for the actual person themselves. You know, that so much attention to detail they could drive themselves a bit mad with it as well. Possibly.
Like, you know, they might be like, it might be they might decide not to go out of the house and attend a very important event because they can't find the pair of shoes that matches their outfit.
Yes. So they probably are pretty tidy, I would say.
Yes.
Same as a Virgo sun, quite organized, but
absolutely,
but not necessarily. They might be tidy, but I don't know that they would be tidy in a particularly elegant way because they don't like Venus or Jupiter, do they? So it might just all be in a very clinical sort of way.
That's interesting. That is something I heard about Virgo rising also, read about also. Yeah. I mean, I think it would be in a way that conveys a sense of efficiency, neatness and efficiency, not necessarily like, you know, something with an elaborately colorful palette, you know, or elaborate design, but an impression that is aesthetically organized, you know. It could even be minimalistic, you know.
Oh yes.
Giving that impression of kind
maybe
of like efficiency and kind of neatness, you know, rather than luxury, you know.
Go on then. What about Capricorn rising?
You don't seem too keen on that.
It's fine. It's fine. Go on. Tell me about Capricorn rising.
Well, I think actually having Capricorn rising might be even more difficult than having. I think Capricorn is by nature more difficult than maybe most of the other signs. And we'll get into that maybe more deeply later when we discuss the planets in relation to the signs. The signs in relation to the planets that rule them. But anyway, so Capricorn energy really takes life very seriously. And always feels like it's it feels like it's responsible in a direct way for the betterment of society, but not only that, but also kind of like to improve itself. It feels like the burden to improve itself by referring to social conventions that are already in place, right, that have their weight, okay, and kind of establishing themselves, their competence in relation to the social structures and the social definitions of success that are in place. So if someone with strong Capricorn energy grows up in a social environment that is very hierarchical, that is very conventional, you know, they're likely to be pretty judgmental toward themselves, and to kind of narrow down the boundaries, right, of definition, for what counts as a, you know, a valuable personality, you know, or a successful individual, you know. So it's a very complicated kind of energy to have as a defining energy. And when Capricorn is your rising sign, that kind of the awareness of social context and social hierarchy, social reality, with all of its, you know, and all of its complexities, and it's like, let's say, centers of gravity, whether it's like the class structure, or like racial hierarchy, or like, you know, the gender structure. So being sensitive to that makes you feel very under pressure to give an impression to people that you are not out of sync with the dominant social definition of the proper life. You know, whether or not deep inside you, you feel like that dominant social definition of the good life is on the mark or totally off the mark, you would still feel this pull to present yourself in a socially acceptable way. And I'd go even farther to say in a socially distinguished way, right? You'd like to present yourself in a way that, you know, encourages people to say like, oh yeah, he's like a very competent person. Oh yes, he knows what he's talking about. Oh, he's pretty successful, etc., etc., etc.
Yeah, I think the Capricorn rising would always be very well prepared for like an interview or something, or for whatever, you know, whatever, or a meeting, something like that. The Capricorn would arrive with a kind of a very kind of professional persona.
Yes, and because Capricorns, they set very high standards of accomplishment for themselves.
Yeah.
And because accomplishment is very important for them, it's like the main way for them to gain a sense of meaning in life, right? To accomplish things on a grand scale, let's say. So you can have a tendency to be very critical of yourself if you fall short of your own expectations, right? And if you're a Capricorn, those expectations will very likely be so high that they're stressful. They'd be stressful for anyone, you know? And so there's always a risk that Capricorns encounter. Now, with it, when your rising sign is in Capricorn, it can get tricky, especially if your sun and moon signs are in signs that are, sorry, if your sun and moon are in signs that are not really compatible with that Capricorn kind of pattern, let's say that energy pattern. Okay, it can get pretty tricky because your rising Capricorn will be kind of pushing you toward performing competence and success, but according to the dominant social definitions of competence and success, right? And meanwhile, your sun sign and your moon sign could be pulling you in very different directions, right? Depending on what they are, you know?
Yeah.
And I think you're more likely to you're likely to have an easier life with a Capricorn rising sign if your sun and moon signs are also in earth signs, because Capricorn it's a very earthy sign, and it's its kind of orientation towards life is grounded in social structures and social belief systems, even I would say, you know. So the earthiness of the two other signs would help it, let's say, yeah, would help the person having all of these different combinations, right?
It probably would be
live in a smoother way, let's say.
quite good for the Capricorn to have a Capricorn sun and rising, actually.
I would say so, yeah.
Yeah, I would say, whereas I think to have the Virgo sun and rising could be quite, it depends which way it goes, but that could be quite difficult. You know, but I think the Capricorn sun and rising is probably a born leader. You know, they're going to come across like a leader, and they probably will carry it through like being a leader as well.
Right. And then the motivations, because like the motivations of your deeper self, right? That's considering the sun as your deeper self, but we'll get to that in a later video. But the motivations of your deeper self will be in line with the persona that you were born to wear.
Yes.
Right? The way of interacting with your reality. Yeah. Yes.
Yeah, I mean, you would probably live up to, you would live up to the kind of the first impression that you've given if you were sun and rising.
Yeah. I would say so.
Just to sort of like complete the picture here, so that Capricorn is ruled by Saturn, which is exalted in Libra. So if Saturn, the planet Saturn, was either in the rising sign, great. But if it happened to be in the sign of Libra, that would be good, actually.
Yeah, I'm really glad you mentioned that.
Yeah, that would be very. Yeah, go on. Yeah.
This is very funny. So in my birth chart, Saturn is in Libra. And like I said, I have a Capricorn ascendant. However, Saturn and Libra forms a very harsh angle called the square with my Capricorn ascendant. And that's why I believe Capricorn rising has been and continues to be a pretty difficult experience for me. Yeah.
Well, Saturn is exalted in Libra, but we also have to sort of take into account that Saturn also rules Aquarius.
Yes.
So if Saturn happens to be in Aquarius, it's in a strong place. And if Saturn was in Cancer or Aries, it's not good for the Saturn. And the moon and Jupiter are not good in Capricorn.
Right. Yes.
That needs to be taken into consideration. If you know, in your rising sign, the moon was there or Jupiter was there. It's interesting, isn't it, that Jupiter doesn't work well in two of those earth signs, in the Virgo and in the Capricorn. Jupiter is not good.
It is interesting, yeah. And for different reasons and different
Yes,
reasons.
yeah.
But yeah.
Yeah. And Mars does very well in Capricorn.
Yeah, I mean, you can sort of understand that because Mars is not really a philosophical planet, I would say. You know, it is about ambition.
Yeah.
You know, and Capricorn and Aries are ambitious, extroverted in different ways. You know.
Yeah.
So you can understand why Mars would be happy.
Yeah. So if you do have Capricorn rising, you do need to look at where Saturn is. Yes. And you do also need to look at which other planets are in that rising sign, if any, you know, to kind of like give the the real nature of what sort of a Capricorn rising you are.
And also, if the planet that rules your rising sign is in a comfortable, let's say, I would say aspect, okay, with your rising sign, you're much likely to be comfortable in the shell of the rising sign when you step out and interact with the world, right?
Yeah.
But if the ruling planet is in a harsh angle, harsh aspect with your rising sign, that'll
Yeah.
that might make the the shell of the rising sign be a bit restrictive for you. Like
Yes.
you might feel like it's a kind of like something you have to wear when you go out, rather than something you're like you slip into by habit when you go
Yeah,
out.
I think it might be quite a difficult rising sign to have if you feel that you've always got to live up to something. Do you know what I mean? Because the expectation is high, isn't it, for
Yeah,
Capricorn?
with Capricorn, and naturally, like
Yeah,
that's the definition. Like
and sometimes you might just feel I just want to relax and just be myself, like whatever that may be, wherever your sun is, and I just feel I always have to put on this professional appearance. So yeah, that could be hard if you're wearing it the whole time. You can't take the shell off. It's not like wearing a pair of tight shoes and when you get home you can take them off and relax. It's with you all the time. The rising sign.
there is this real risk with Capricorn rising, or I mean, I would say no, with like overstressed Capricorn energy in general, of like never finding anything you accomplish to be enough, and always like feeling like, okay, this was good, but this was good just for that time. It doesn't mean that I've mastered it, doesn't mean that I'm
Right.
I have to prove myself in the next task,
Mm.
So yeah, it's a challenge, and I would advise anyone who's a fellow Capricorn rising, or even if you have a very strong kind of Capricorn sun energy, to work on being less demanding on yourself. Just take life less seriously, I would say. Yeah.
Well, that was very interesting. That was good talking about the rising signs in all the earth signs. So any comments, any sort of questions or comments or additions, let us know. And we will be doing, what should we do next? Next we could the water signs?
Yeah, sure. Yeah.
The rising signs and the water signs. So we'll do that over the next few days and speak soon, Khalid. That was great. Bye for now.
Enjoyed a lot.
Bye.
Mandy. Bye-bye. Bye-bye.